Hello, welcome back, and it is great to be here with you once again today. My name is Nathan House, and I am with the Houston Church of Christ in Houston, California. And if you could like or subscribe to this video, that would be great. Thank you so much. I want to begin today. Again, we're going through the book of Psalms, and as I've already made mention, we're not going to be looking at every single psalm. We're going to be picking up today in Psalm chapter 8. One of the great psalms, if you ask me, one of the great psalms in all of the psalms. What a wonderful psalm. Such an encouraging psalm, such a beautiful psalm, such a uh, deep psalm. And again, we'll look at, you can kind of begin by just noticing again the different way the psalms are organized based off of some of their characteristics. And so this is Psalm chapter 8 that we're going to look at. And you can see that it is clustered here with these psalms of praise. And so we'll get into that psalm. We'll get into this at this time, and we'll notice some interesting things and hopefully challenge ourselves to consider God in our lives a little bit more. So in Psalm chapter 8, verse 1, I want to go ahead and look at this, how the psalm begins. He says, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babies and infants, you have established strength because of your foes, to steal the enemy and the avenger." I want to draw your attention back to the very beginning phrase, verse 1. "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." So again, just a couple of observations about the text. You'll first notice that he has two different words here for Lord, and that in the translations demonstrate this usually by using all caps and then lower caps, or sorry, regular letters here. So here's all caps. So this is the word Yahweh, or the name of God, Yahweh. This is Adon or Adonai. So again, the name of God, Yahweh, describing, followed by a position, if you will, Master, Lord. So, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all of the earth. If you come down and look at the very end of this chapter, O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all of the earth. And so what you see here is that this is called a bookend or bookends. When you have a similar or identical phrase at the beginning and then again at the end, so everything in between it's bookends, right? And so really these two bookends form the thesis statement for this chapter. This is what David is going to try to prove, that the Lord's name is majestic in all of the earth. So as he leaves from this opening statement, and then again he'll end with it as well, but what is he doing in between here? He's giving proof for the majesty of the name of the Lord. And so that's what he's doing in the rest of this chapter. And so you'll just see here, I've made mention of this on this slide here. The thesis statement bookends the chapter, right? So everything else in between verses 1 and 9 are given proof for the majesty of the name of the Lord, the reason that the Lord's name is majestic. And so as we go through this, I want you to note God's actions, see what God is doing, see how he is doing these things, and do they not declare the majesty of the Lord? And also really quickly, very important to note that there is a very significant question that occurs in this chapter, a very significant question that occurs. And so we'll get to that question in a second. But again, draw your attention back to this. He says, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." Well, why is his name majestic? You have set your glory above the heavens. So again, what does he mean by above the heavens? I believe if you come down here to look at verse 3, you'll see what he means. And so we'll get to that in a second. You have set your glory above the heavens, out of the mouths of babies and infants. So babies, and Jesus Christ quotes this passage, verse 2, demonstrating that the creation of God speaks to the majesty, speaking of himself in that passage when he quotes it. These things speak to his majesty, but they're praising God. Even something as insignificant seemingly, or as weak, or whatever, as babies and infants, they speak the praises of God. Verse 3, notice this. When I look at your heavens, and again, you have set your glory above the heavens. When I look at your heavens, well, what is he talking about? The moon and the stars. When I look at your heavens, the works of your fingers. And again, these are describing, the psalmist David is describing the actions of God. Why is God worthy? Why is his name majestic? When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place. So as David sits outside on a night like many of us have, and we've stared up at the sky, we've seen, the beauty of the stars, the moon, the bright, beautiful moon, the full moon, or maybe just a sliver of a moon, but the stars and how beautiful they are. And again, I live in California, Central California. It's hard to see the stars sometimes because we have a lot of agriculture and dirt in the air, especially recently. We've had dirt and smoke. But on those clear nights when you can see the stars and they're so beautiful, it makes you stop and realize, doesn't it? It's an amazing thing to stop and to look at those stars. And we understand more today than, David did. As we look at these stars, we understand the vastness of our universe more and more. But as David looked at these things, when I look at your heavens, the moon and the stars, it made David ask a question. Why do you care about something as insignificant as me, as humanity? Why do you care about us? When I look at these things that you have done, how capable you are, how great you are, these things, and again, the universe, one thing always seems to be changing is this. We're always finding the universe is bigger than we thought it was, right? More stars than we thought, more galaxies than we thought. It's, the numbers are staggering, and, I don't even need to bring them up. The numbers of how many stars and how many galaxies are staggering. And David simply describes them as the work of your fingers. They're just something your finger. And again, does that not demonstrate the greatness of God, that these things are the works of his fingers? You set them in place. They have a proper place, and God set them there. And yet, as David contemplates this creation and the majesty of this creation, he can't help but ask the question, what is man that you're mindful of him? And the Son of Man that you care for him? As David contemplates the greatness, the vastness of God, the vastness of his creation, he is blown away by the fact that God cares for mankind. See, he's laying out a reason why God's name is majestic in all the earth. Because of his work through creation, because of his care for mankind. And then he'll continue looking at the actions of God, specifically as they relate to humanity. He says, yet you have made him. And again, look at these 4 verbs describe what God has done, concerning humanity, right? You have made him. God made him. Where did God place him in this order? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. And if you'll notice this, kind of an interesting, you have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings, Elohim, the heavenly beings. You've made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. That's the first verb, where God has made him. Second verb, you've crowned him with glory and honor. Third verb, you have given him dominion over the works of your hands. So of all the things God has created, look at what he has done for humanity. Look at the position he has given humanity. You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings. You crowned him with glory and honor. You've given him dominion over the works of your hands. And watch this, you have put all things under his feet. And then there's a list that follows, right, of all of these things that God has placed under the dominion of mankind, under the dominion of humanity. All sheep and oxen, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. God placed them under mankind, under his feet. And so again, all of these things speak to why is God's name majestic in all the earth? Why does he begin and end this chapter with this thesis statement? O Yahweh, our Master, our Lord, our Adonai, how majestic is your name in all the earth. Well, why is it majestic? Because of his creative work. Because of his giving to humanity this privileged position, because of him giving to humanity his care in the first place. And again, verse 4 becomes the center thought, if you will, of this chapter. What is man that you're mindful of him? And again, isn't that an interesting question? Why does God care for mankind? Why does God care for humanity? Why does God care for you? Why does God care for me? We live in a world that so many times wants to remove the value of God's of humanity. It wants to elevate the value of everything else, the trees, animals. And again, I'm not saying we shouldn't care about trees and animals, but it is God who placed man where man is. We are there because God placed us there. God made us after his own image in Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2. God has crowned us with glory and honor. As you look at this psalm, it's very interesting to look at this psalm. And David applied this exalted position to humanity. And again, he was amazed. He was in awe that God cared for someone or something as small as himself, as small as humanity. But its ultimate fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment of Psalm 8 is not found in us necessarily, although there is definitely a fulfillment in us as human, as God's humanity, right? As the pinnacle of God's creation. But there is a greater fulfillment to this found in Jesus Christ himself. There's a greater fulfillment because the New Testament writers take Psalm chapter 8 and they begin here in this chapter in verse 5 and 6, and they demonstrate these things were ultimately found to have a greater fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Notice a couple of verses. Here in the book of Hebrews, the Hebrew writer uses this Psalm chapter 8 to demonstrate the superiority of Jesus Christ. Look at what the Hebrew writer says. It was not to angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. So God never placed the world under the subjection of angels, the creative world, or the world to come. It has been testified somewhere, and he just speaks of it generically as to where it is found, but we know it to be Psalm 8. It has been testified somewhere. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the Son of Man that you care for him? You have made him for a little while lower than the angels. You have crowned him with glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. So he quotes this here, but now look at what he does. Now look at how the Hebrew writer says its ultimate fulfillment is through Jesus Christ. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, talking about subjection to Christ, he has left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while, and so here he picks up on a phrase here, you have made him a little while lower than the angels. So he gives this a temporal sense, a timing sense, a sense of Jesus Christ was momentarily placed in a place of submission to the angels, or maybe not submission is not the right word, a place lower than the angels. But we see him for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus. We see him crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. So Jesus Christ ultimately was the one who was made for a little while lower than the angels, who was ultimately crowned with glory and honor, and who ultimately will have everything in subjection to him. Well, this isn't the only passage that alludes to this. Look at 1 Corinthians 15. The Apostle Paul says, verse 27, for God has put all things in subjection under his feet. But when it says all things are put in subjection, it is plain that he is accepted to who put all things in subjection under him. So here he's saying everything was put in subjection to Christ except for God himself. But notice what he says here. Go back to verse 25. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. God has put all things in subjection under his feet. See, Jesus Christ has death in subjection to him. Let's look at another passage. Ephesians chapter 1, beginning in verse 20. He demonstrated his power in the Messiah by raising him from the dead and seating him at his right hand in the heavens. Look at this. Far above every ruler and authority, power and dominion, and every title given. Way too often, I think people read these things and they're thinking human powers, human authority, but this is not how Paul is using this. Paul is speaking of demonic forces, spiritual enemies of God. as well as other created beings. Every rule, every ruler, every authority, every power, every dominion, every title given, not only in this age, but also in the age to come. And now he quotes Psalm 8, he has put everything under his feet. All of these things God has put under the feet, under the authority of Jesus Christ, who Psalm 8 finds its ultimate fulfillment in. Go to staying in the book of Ephesians, go to chapter 6. He says in verse 12, for our battle is not, actually let's begin in verse 10. Finally be strong in the Lord and by his vast strength. Put on the full armor of God so that you may be able to stand against the tactics of the devil. For our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers. See, look at these, they're the similar phrases to what we just saw back in chapter 1, verse 22. And he says, they're not flesh and blood. These rulers, these authorities, they're not flesh and blood. That's not who we're warring against. But we are warring against rulers and authorities, against the world powers of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavens. You see, God placed everything. God placed everything in subjection to him. All of these things were placed in subjection to Jesus Christ, who for a little while was made lower than the angels. So when we're looking at Psalm chapter 8, there is the fulfillment, there is the reality that these things David saw amazed him. God's care for humanity, so seemingly insignificant, amazed David, and it should amaze us that God cares for us, that God has placed in us a value that is greater than we probably understand. There is a value that God has placed in you. There's a value that God has placed in me. What a shame it is today when we as Christians vote to kill babies, when we as Christians promote things that take the lives of the innocent children. We have to stand against those things that remove the value of life that God has placed in humanity. So the Psalm 8 speaks to the value of mankind and the majesty of God that he cared about us. But it also speaks to the fulfillment of Jesus Christ and his position and his rule as the one who is over all of these other forces, all of these dark things, all of these evil spiritual demonic forces. Christ rules over them. I want to end again with this thought. What do we take from this? What do we take from this? That we have a God whose name is majestic and worthy of praise because he cares for us. And if he cares for us, we need to care for ourselves and we need to care for others. Thank you for your time. God bless.